Hello and welcome to this video on Magnolia as a species for bonsai. A magnolia are a kind of flowering tree. The variety and type of magnolia means they can become a stunning bonsai if handled well, but at the same time they are somewhat temperamental. There are a range of magnolia species. Of these, only a few are used as bonsai, but amongst those you'll find that the most common will be the candle flame and star magnolias. The magnolia itself as a bonsai has fine branches, a stark contrasting bark colour, and leaves and flowers at scale to the size of the bonsai. As a broad rule, they are susceptible to seasonal changes, but especially the cold. What makes them attractive as a bonsai is their floral display, and the fact that they produce a very nice smell, although if you get hay fever, maybe not. Magnolia as a broad family is actually a very big genus of, flowering shrubs, effectively. Shrub to tree depending on where you live and the kind available. There are up to 340 specimens within this, and so it is big. In fact, you can find it across most of the world, from Southeast Asia, Central Asia, parts of North America, Central America, and even the West Indies. There are even a few species found in South America, although more an exception to the rule. What's weird is that the stunning and rather large flowering magnolia seems to have existed before bees did, so the reason for it to have such an attractive and, strongly smelling flower is odd. When we talk about the growth of the magnolia outside of bonsai, they are a large spreading evergreen or sometimes deciduous tree. They have, as we've mentioned, fragrant flowers, but what is important for the kind you would see growing in gardens is that the flowers are quite large. They'll either be bowl-shaped or star-shaped, although, as mentioned, we also find the candle flame shape available as well. They come in white, pink, purple, green, or yellow. The flowers themselves appear in spring, and then later on produce a cone-like fruit. The flowers are very long-lasting, and this is useful as, you have a long-lasting floral display. The flower itself is relatively straightforward, although it does, as mentioned, have some caveats when it comes to seasonality. Particularly, the flowers don't like being cold and can be easily damaged. When you bonsai a magnolia, things are a little easier, largely because we focus on only a few species and these tend to be more resilient to what happens to them, which does make life a bit, more practical for the bonsai enthusiast. Looking particularly at the star magnolia, although again other options do exist, its fine or thinner twigs, small leaves, and the relatively smaller flowers make it a very suitable candidate for bonsai. Again, we're talking about all of the desired features of a bonsai. Thin twigs, which can easily ramify, leading to lots and lots of new flowers and leaves. Lots of flowers and also a dense canopy is an attractive feature. Although in winter you do lose the leaves, at least in some species, and others you don't. If you want to have a winter display and a spring display, this is a good species for that reason. The leaves themselves are narrow and dark in coloration, although they will turn yellow in autumn. Others will effectively keep their leaves right throughout the year and be mostly green rather than a greyish green. The bark will vary in colour from a light grey, that is very smooth, through to a very rough, almost cork-like appearance. The flowers appear in spring, and this is why they are useful. Because the flowers, depending on if we're talking about the star magnolia or other varieties, exist very much set out from the rest of the tree. In fact, you can almost think of them as like a second canopy over the leaf canopy. They're notable for their, long white petals in the case of a white flower. Whether these white flowers are in a long candle flame shape or spread out more flat like the star magnolia is. The usefulness of this is that overall you can make it for anywhere between a medium and small bonsai, and in some instances even show-in, although generally speaking small and medium are, arguably the best options here. In terms of the species, we've mentioned the star magnolia in particular, largely due to its star-shaped flowers. It's also notable for its, fine foliage and branch structure. You have the southern magnolia, but this is generally going to be a much larger tree. Because of this, you really only want to be training it in medium, if not possibly, arguably, a large bonsai. But it does have notable flowers and it is very fragrant. This means it can be well appreciated by those who know what they're looking at, and others might mistake it for topiary. You have the Jane Magnolia, which is a hybrid, and what makes this special, apart from it being a hybrid, is its coloration. It is notably more colourful than others. And then you have the Lily Magnolia as the final. And these produce tulip-like, or as we've described it, candle flame-like flowers. In terms of what you get when you are training a magnolia as a bonsai, you're looking at three major things. First, you want the flowers, because these are the attractive thing here. Depending on what you're growing effectively, you may find that you produce something with a very strong odor, and this may not be something you want. In other cases, it may not have any odor at all. So just be mindful that different species of magnolia do have different strengths to their smell and kinds of flowers they make. But there are also, and this is the second reason that magnolia are somewhat interesting for bonsai enthusiasts, a very wide variety. Arguably, with just those four we've mentioned, they are the tip of the iceberg and you can go a lot further. And finally, the year-round ability to display this. As we've mentioned, it has a stunning spring flowering display that lasts right through to autumn. The autumn display is the changing coloration of the leaves, and in winter, the bare branch structure, given how fine it is, can be an excellent winter exhibit example. Because it has distinct flowers, an attractive foliage canopy, and largely able to be styled in a wide range of ways, it's something that can be very useful, but it's most certainly not something you want to start on right away. Then we have what styles are actually suitable. Now, you can try just about everything with Magnolia. There are some exceptions, but for the most part you can have a crack at most styles. Because of how it grows and the nature of it, the informal upright is a good option to start with if you're just first having a go at this. We suggest the informal upright simply because it lends itself well to the way Magnolia naturally grows. This means you're not having to curtail growth or redirect anything. You're working to its strengths. As you go with larger species, you would obviously have to choose, ways to, work with or arguably against those natural habits of the species you've chosen. It's also useful to choose one that you're happy to be blunt about it, are willing to take some damage with regards to. That is a specimen that isn't something you're going to be overly attached to, at least at first, as we've found, at least amongst our collection, that the magnolia we have had tend to be somewhat variable, and so you need to get to know each individual tree rather than relying necessarily as much on a species guide. And this does bring us somewhat to the growing medium. Thankfully, this isn't so bad. That's because most magnolia rely on the same soil, but you'll have to look at things like repotting, fertilising and similar. That's what's going to vary. In terms of the soil you use, it's actually relatively straightforward. You can use any standard soil mix. It is a good idea to make it slightly acidic with a pH between 5.5 and 6.5, but it's not necessary. A good, organic matter-rich soil will support growth, and as long as you use fertilizer regularly, it should be fine. If you are worried about the pH, sulfur and peat moss will lower it, while dolomite or lime will bring it up. So you can adjust this as needed. Just be aware that it is, in some respects, harder to fix it if you shift too far in one direction than the other, so you're better off being more gradual and slowly altering pH in soil. In terms of the magnolia's growth itself and watering, your major worry here is just getting it waterlogged, leading to root rot. So long as you're using a good, well-draining soil mix, no issue there. However, if you're trying to grow it in the ground, at least initially, to get better in the barry for instance, then you do need to be aware of this. The other noteworthy thing is, water. If your tap water, for instance, has a high mineral content, you may find that it either turns it acidic or similar. Fertilising is one that's a little more tricky. And fertilizing is tricky largely because you need to balance the growth of the magnolia, notably the foliage canopy, against the desire for a floral display. If you have too much nitrogen, you'll get lots of leaves, but they'll be big and annoying, but you'll get fewer flowers. If you don't support the leaves, you'll get more flowers, but the growth won't be as good. This is where pruning becomes important. In terms of large branches, prune those back in winter when the magnolia is dormant. This is also helpful to prune back branches you can't get access to the rest of the time, because, well, rather obviously, given that the tree is dormant and that it has lost its leaves, they're visible. When in summer, due to the support of fertilizer and growth of the magnolia, you just don't have the ability to get to these, so take advantage of the opportunity to remove these inside branches you do not want in winter. Also during summer, thin out some of the canopy. It's more to remove large leaves and let light penetrate deeper into the branch structure and canopy, so as to promote more ramification than anything else. If you find that your foliage is still quite large and you want to reduce it, this can be done by cutting the leaves in half. And just make sure to cut the leaf at an angle so as to form the necessary point, so it looks similar to the normal leaf shape. If not perfectly, certainly close enough. You will find that Magnolia has an unwanted habit of producing suckers. These are basically shoots from the roots at the bottom that try and grow up like new trees. Great if you want to try and create a forest-like scenario, terrible for anything else. Thankfully, easily dealt with. Get your forefinger and thumb and gently squeeze them and pinch them so as to cut them off. Or use scissors, but in some ways pinching them out does feel so much more satisfying. The other reason you want to remove these if you're not going as something like a forest is that, well, they take away growth from other parts of your bonsai magnolia, so obviously detracting from growth that you do want. Wiring is a little more difficult, and this is because the bark of the magnolia is at least somewhat delicate, and this means it can easily start to bite into or cut into the branch and the bark around it. This means you need to keep a close eye on any wiring that you've done. One way to get around this is things like guy wires, strings with weights on them, and so on, but we have a video dedicated to solving the issue of, well, delicate branches. But it is something you need to be very careful of. In terms of its positioning, magnolia needs to be in a full sun and at worst partial shade. This is because they need that light. Ideally, you have your magnolia in full sun for about 4 to 6 hours each day. This is also important when we talk about the cold periods of the year. They do not like the cold, and this can be a big problem. If your magnolia is exposed to cold, especially in early spring, so if you're in an area that has late yearly frosts, this is a concern. You will find that those frosts damage the leaf buds and flower buds, if not destroy the flowers as well, meaning that your magnolia doesn't really have a floral display and may not put on proper leaf development either, so these are all issues to be aware of. One way to get around this, other than to be mindful of positioning, is you can actually bring your magnolia inside or place it in some sort of greenhouse structure. Depending on where you are, inside may be more pragmatic. You do want to keep it near a light, or preferably a window, but not so close to the window that the cold causes the same issues if you bring it inside. Repotting is relatively straightforward for magnolias, mostly. The tree will need to be repotted roughly every 2 to 3 years. As the magnolia gets older, this shouldn't be a concern. You repot it in your standard bonsai mix, arguably with a little bit of extra organic matter and some slight acidic elements added to it. As it gets older, this happens less frequently, and you need to be careful of what you do to it exactly as it gets older. This is because the magnolia is a species that doesn't take well to having its roots pruned. This is where you're going to have to consider carefully about whether or not you want a magnolia, particularly because as they get older, you will eventually have to plant them into a larger pot. The reason for this is simple. the roots grow very quickly and take up a lot of the space in the pot, meaning they need to be repotted. Because you can't cut off a lot of the root mass, when you go to repot it, it's not so easy to do. And as mentioned in one of our other videos, you'll need to consider ways around this. Particularly if you want to maintain drainage. If you don't have proper drainage, well, you technically are going to get root pruning, but that's by virtue of root rot, which is a bad way to do it. Other than the issues of having to consider repotting into a larger pot and maintaining the root pruning to a minimum, you can get away with a lot of other, let's say, mistreatment when it comes to repotting. Surprisingly, they can tolerate becoming root bound surprisingly quickly. Or it'd be more accurate to say that the tree itself tends to do this anyway. So, although it may seem odd, by comparison to other species, where if you cut off a third of the root mass, you literally cut off a third, you are cutting off considerably less with the magnolia, but the amount of space you get is more. Other than the problems around root pruning, it's always worthwhile to keep an eye on the roots when you do repot to ensure there are no issues with rot occurring that you haven't noticed from an outside perspective. In terms of pests and diseases, magnolia are basically susceptible to the standard suspects. These are going to be things like aphids, scale, mites, and similar. The only other concern you might say is that if you are using a fertilizer rich in certain minerals or metals, for example calcium, these might show up in affecting the soil. But other than that, you don't have massive worries, and to be quite blunt, if you're using a fertilizer that strong in these metals or minerals, you have bigger issues to worry about. In short, magnolia can produce a stunning floral display. They smell amazing if you're so inclined. If you get a deciduous variety, you get year-round, attractive-looking trees. You can use them in spring for floral displays, summer for just a pretty tree, autumn for autumnal colours, and in winter a bare tree as exhibits. Admittedly, the coloration of the trunk may not be to your liking, as it's a greyish and in some cases white trunk. But then again, you have a wide range of flower colours to offset this in spring, so it's up to you to decide whether or not you appreciate the variety of colours, textures, and variety of features the magnolia has, given the amount of work that goes into them. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.